Ford takes a $20 billion write-down on its electric vehicle business as the U.S. and the European Union move to water down their clean car mandates. But California regulators, on the other hand, refuse to quit subsidizing a solar thermal electricity plant even after it proves not to be cost competitive.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleague on the editorial page, columnist Alicia Finley. It's been a rough year for the subsidized business of selling electric cars. Big news story from Detroit before the holidays being that Ford is now taking a $19.5 billion charge related to its electric vehicle businesses. CEO Jim Farley said this: instead of plowing billions into the future, knowing these large EVs will never make money, we are pivoting, unquote. Here's a bit more of what Jim Farley told Bloomberg TV.
It was really the customer changing their decision. We saw hybrids really take off last couple of years, last month we had a 30% increase in our hybrid sales. We're now number 3 I think we're 80% hybrid market share in trucks. So we saw this happening. We also saw the more expensive EVs, really suffer in the market, and the more affordable EVs to do better. And then the last couple months really was remarkable. The EV market in the U.S. went from 12% in the industry to only 5%. And that really, in the end, was the big decider for us. But look, we're going to 50% electric. It's going to be hybrids and E-revs and electric. It won't be just pure electrics.
Alicia, what do you make of this move by Ford and the larger trends, what's going on in the auto business?
Well, I think it's bowing to climate and economic realities. People weren't buying EVs in the numbers that automakers projected. You had the $77,500 EV tax credit, federal EV tax credit, go away in September, which thereby effectively increased the price for most customers who had been eligible. Earlier in the year, you actually saw a surge in purchases of EVs, and this actually occurred even in the spring when consumers were already anticipating that this extra EV tax credit would go away. And so when Jim Farley mentioned that you saw the market go from 12%, well, it really wasn't 12%. It was, for the most part, 8% until you had that surge. And so it dropped back down to 5%, or dropped down to 5% after you had that surge. So I think the market's probably now adjusting. You've seen companies that, like Ford, GM also canceled some EV models and has pulled back its investment. It had plans to go all electric by 2035. It's slowly and discreetly kind of walked that back, realizing that customers aren't there. Now you're seeing Ford pivot some to hybrids, which is actually what Toyota had been doing and pushing. And this is because customers, there are some maybe fuel savings, or they can save money on fuel with hybrids. And it's kind of the best of both worlds, but they still have that backup, gas, if they're going on long trips. Ford's now planning to make or push more a hybrid version of its F-150 instead of its all electric, and this will supposedly be able to go 700 miles. So I think what you're seeing is now companies are trying to meet customers where they're at, which is what they probably should have been doing all along, but for the government subsidies and mandates, which effectively require them to make more EVs.
To that point, I got a bit of a kick out of Jim Farley's statement there. Remarkable, the changing market conditions in the last couple months, the share of the EV market falling. I mean, it's amazing when you stop handing out $7,500 to everybody who buys one of these EVs. No surprise that consumers and customers on auto lots respond to that. Something that I think is important to note here is that this is a long pattern in the auto business, but all sorts of businesses. If people want hybrid vehicles, fine. Maybe they like them. Maybe they are concerned about their footprint environmentally. Maybe they think they have less maintenance issues. Maybe they think it's the wave of the future and they want to buy something that they think will have better resale value. Whatever it is, if these vehicles can compete on a level playing field in the market, then fine. But it strikes me, Alicia, that these CEOs are happy to get into bed with whatever politicians happen to be setting government policy at any given moment. And notably, every 4 years, that often changes. It calls to mind a classic editorial the Journal ran in 1979, also about the auto business as it happens, under the headline "Down with Big Business." And Alicia, you wrote about this a little bit earlier this year with respect to General Motors. General Motors' CEO, all on board with the Joe Biden clean car agenda. Now suddenly changing who's sitting in the Oval Office. She's been saying nice things about how tariffs, an auto CEO saying that tariffs can help level the playing field. It's just a good reminder, I think, to keep in mind that the CEOs have a job for their business, their employees, and their shareholders, which is not necessarily the same thing as standing up for the free market.
I agree to a large extent. What you saw with GM, which is a classic example of Mary Barra trying to curry favor with the political class, in part to mitigate the impacts of regulation on her business. And I'm specifically alluding to the California standards EV mandates, as well as the fuel economy standards that were being pushed by the Biden administration and the greenhouse gas emission standards. Now, the Biden administration did end up easing up on its initial proposal for those fuel economy standards, particularly on trucks, after Mary Barra went in and protested some. They were still would be very difficult to reach, but they weren't as punishing as they were initially at least proposed. I think she was also hoping to get some more government subsidies. I mean, Jim Farley was also out there, by the way, advocating and promoting the EV agenda in hopes that the government may lavish out more subsidies. We mentioned the $7,500 tax credit. Well, actually, the initial bill, the Build Back Better bill, had a $12,500 tax credit, specifically for plants or automakers that use unionized labor. And that would have tremendously benefited the big three, Ford, Stellantis, and GM, that use union labor and put its competitors at disadvantage. So I think that they were trying to essentially lobby Washington and get the rules set in their favor. And I think that this can often backfire for companies. And I do worry, and I do think that that's what Mary Barra is up to with the tariffs too. And they've been somewhat successful in that. And that's why the tariffs haven't had as disastrous impact on the industry as you might think, is because many of the US manufacturers, at least, have been able to get regulatory dispensations on, for instance, parts that are being imported from Mexico and Canada. So it has actually these tariffs actually hit much harder foreign automakers. Now, to your point, I think that all businesses ultimately lose. All shareholders are going to ultimately lose out on this. But I think when you have every company basically lobbying for its own interest, the result is to some extent a sort of tragedy of the commons, where everyone ends up losing or not doing as well as they would if you had an open free market.
On the point about the changing regulatory environment in Washington, one of the moves that the Trump administration made earlier this month is to revise the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards that are applied to automakers. And it's interesting, Alicia, because the revisions will still require car maker fleets to have average fuel economy by 2031 of 34.5 miles per gallon. That is up from 30.4 per gallon this year. So, Alicia, what is the practical effect of these changes? There were some headlines about the Trump administration rolling back fuel economy standards, but the economy standards are notably still going up.
Just to back up a little bit, the fuel economy standards are actually required by statute versus the greenhouse gas emission standards that the EPA separately sets. And that's actually still that's being litigated in the courts whether it even has this authority. Now, what Congress did in the tax bill is zeroed out the penalty for non-compliance. Therefore, even if the Trump administration weren't to ease or reduce what the Biden standards were, the companies still wouldn't have to pay a penalty for not complying with the rules. Now, I think what's important to point out is the Trump benchmarks are lower than what the Biden benchmarks would have been. But on the other hand, one of the reasons is they don't get credits, special or more credits for producing more EVs, or for that matter, using these quote unquote what were called off-cycle credits for that they got, for instance, for using certain technologies that the government claimed would reduce their emissions or increase fuel economy, but didn't necessarily show that on the tests that were run. So there are a lot fewer opportunities for gaming the regulations. I would argue that these new standards are much more honest in terms of actually showing what the fuel economy of the cars are, rather than allowing these companies to go around and parade that, oh, our average fuel economy is 50 miles per gallon, when they're nowhere even close to that. It's just these credits that essentially allow them to game the system.
On gaming the system, something to understand that I think is important is that these CAFE standards are applied to manufacturers' fleets. And so if you want to keep selling SUVs that are below the target, then you need to sell more electric vehicles and hybrids and so forth that are above the target. And so it creates a whole opaque system of cross-subsidization that is invisible to the consumer on the car lot, trying to figure out why any particular vehicle is priced more or less than any other vehicle. Another point, the Journal's editorial on this also has a nice line about one piece of this Department of Transportation move. It says crossovers are really passenger cars, but manufacturers have designed them with features solely intended to meet the regulatory definition of a pickup to meet CAFE mandates. The result has been little added functionality, reduced fuel economy performance, added cost, and a fairly homogeneous design language lacking in creativity. But Alicia, that's another example of how the government CAFE regulation, what technically under the rules qualifies as a passenger car versus a pickup, creates incentives for these companies to put enormous amounts of energy into meeting the regulation, which is not exactly meeting the customer and what the customer might actually want.
Right. It creates all kinds of regulatory distortions, limits consumer choice, limits competition, and it results in car makers producing, as you point out, homogenous vehicles. And so I think what you saw with the Ford announcement is it was losing a lot of money every year, $5.5 billion estimated this year. That was required to essentially lose under these, in part under these rules. And it's decided, well, no, we're going to cut our losses and start producing more of the kind of cars and vehicles that consumers want. And in that way, I think the regulatory, if you want to call it rollback or deregulation, whatever you want to call it, has really empowered companies to serve and serve their customers and meet the customers, as I was saying, where they are, rather than currying favor to the politicians. The purpose or the mission of most businesses should be to produce products that their customers want, not to produce products that the politicians want them to make. And I think this now the deregulation has enabled the companies to do that and not lose money.
A smaller step in the European Union, the European Commission, moving to water down an electric vehicle mandate there. There was a rule that would have outlawed the sale of gas cars by 2035. Now there's a new rule that's being proposed that requires a 90% emissions reduction. So that's a a small step back toward the reality that these vehicles are going to be around, are going to be useful still for a long time. But Alicia, there's also a countervailing temptation. It's always easy for politicians and policymakers to set a net zero target that is 10 or 15 years in the future and let the next guy in office figure out how actually to either meet it or to roll it back in a way that saves some face. But the alternative option is to double down. And a notable other green energy story here from California. Talk about the issue of this solar thermal electricity plant that California regulators are now treating as a stranded asset.
Right. So this Ivanpah plant came online more than or about a decade ago, and it was using kind of an embryonic solar thermal technology that really wasn't proven. It was extremely expensive, or cost about $180 per megawatt hour. Just to put that in perspective, natural gas plants can produce power at about 40 megawatts per hour. Even solar these days, because of the decline in solar panel, photovoltaic solar panel prices, they can produce power at about 40 megawatt hours too. So the problem was that the state, encouraged, by the way, by Obama federal loan guarantee, as well as another grant, PG&E, which is the electric utility up north, invested in this project and signed a long-term power purchase agreement with the investors of this in this solar plant. But it became increasingly uneconomic. It was killing, by the way, thousands of birds each year. The world's probably largest avian incinerator. And as a result, customers were paying more for power than they would otherwise if they were just getting the same power even from other kinds of solar plants. So PG&E sought to get out of this contract, to cancel contract. The developers agreed, and even the Biden Energy Department agreed, even though it may end up taking a loss on those loans or the loan guarantees. And this would, as a result, at least by an energy analyst, Robert Bryce, save customers about $100 million every year on their power rates. Now that's back of the envelope calculation. But then you had Gavin Newsom's Public Utilities Commission come and say, no, we won't let you cancel these agreements, because then it would become all this, the money that was invested, hundreds of millions of dollars in connecting this plant to the grid, would become a quote unquote stranded asset. And so we're going to require you to continue to fund or basically pay for this power at elevated rates or excessive rates. Just so so the other investments don't end up, we don't have to write down those losses. And I think this is just an illustration of how the travails when government starts mandating what companies do. I mean, PG&E probably wouldn't have even made this contract with this solar plant were not for the state's renewable mandate, which is now about 60% by 2030. And it forced the company, or forced the utility, to enter into a long-term agreement for technology that was unproven at excessive costs. Then new technology came along that was cheaper and made this plant uneconomic. And I think what you're likely to see is that same kind of forces market forces occur in the battery technology, where now the state is forcing, companies or utilities to commission battery power to back up solar. And right now, battery power still is very expensive. The technology isn't all that great. It can produce power for 4 hours maybe at a time. But I think over time, over the next decade or so, you could actually see the prices decline and the technology improve, and such that the batteries that PG&E and some other utilities in California have signed contracts with will be also become uneconomic and become extremely costly for customers.
It's the risk of picking winners and losers outside of market forces, of having the government do that, of having these kinds of renewable mandates that do that, picking new technologies and trying to force them into the market. This Ivanpah plant uses mirrors to focus sunlight and create heat. And that is what is driving the electricity generation. But as it turns out, new photovoltaic cells are more efficient at that. And so, Alicia, I mean, is that one lesson here is if government gets into the business of trying to pick a one solar generation method, or as you're pointing out, batteries. I mean, I've often wondered about the electric vehicle charging stations that the Biden administration was busy putting out, if they were going to be put in places that turned out to be not economical, if they were going to turn out to have technologies that would be passed by on the highway, as it were, by better technologies. And maybe the answer is going to be more hybrids, like the Ford CEO is saying there. But the risk of having the government try to force assets and investment in one area and push the market in that direction is sometimes the market doesn't want to be pushed and ends up flowing a different way.
Right. So I think that is the lesson here. You ended up with quote unquote stranded asset. It's kind of interesting that you mentioned the electric vehicle charging stations, because when states were required to submit their plans to the Biden administration to use this $7.5 billion, I think that was $7.5 billion pot of money for from the infrastructure bill for EV charging stations, many of them warned that these EV charging stations wouldn't be economic, that maybe the companies, if they doled out the money, would end up abandoning them because they couldn't make money, because they were required to put them in sort of rural areas where there weren't a lot of customers, or that the technology would just improve such so that they could be new technology or new chargers would come along that could charge cars a lot faster, like maybe 10, 20 minutes instead of several hours. And these all this money, this investment, this taxpayer investment would essentially become stranded. And it's ironic because that's what you essentially heard or argued from the climate crowd for restricting investment in fossil fuels, is that they said, well, if you build this pipeline, it's going to become a stranded asset because their fossil fuels are going away, and therefore we shouldn't allow any investment because it'll become stranded. Well, I think companies make that decision. And companies aren't going to make an investment if they don't see a future, or if they don't think it'll pay off in the long run. But the problem is when government politicians start to dictate investments and what they think will be profitable or should be profitable and what companies should do, there's ends up being deadweight losses, to use an economic term. And that's what you saw with the Ivanpah plant. And I think that's what you saw with the Ford write-down earlier this month.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next year with another edition of Potomac Watch.